No Wall They Can Build, a guide to borders and migration across North America. Episode 10, From East to West, Part 1, Chaos and Order, and Transformation.
This is the best I can do to tell the story of irregular migration in North America. This story is not unique to the United States, or even to the West. Variations on it can be found wherever comparative poverty and instability meet comparative wealth and stability. From Haiti into the Dominican Republic, from the many countries of West Africa through Morocco into Spain, from both West Africa and East Africa, Somalia, Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, through Libya and across the Mediterranean Sea to Italy at Lampedusa, from East Africa over the Sinai Peninsula into Israel, from the Central African Republic to anywhere else, from Southern Africa, especially Zimbabwe, into South Africa, from the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, and Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, through Turkey and across the Eastern Mediterranean into Greece at Lesbos, from Bangladesh into India, from both Bangladesh and Myanmar, especially of Rohingya people, over the Andaman Sea and into Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and the Philippines into the Gulf states through the Kafala system, from North Korea across China and Laos into Thailand and then South Korea, from rural China to urban China, owing to the Hukou system, and from various parts of Asia and the Middle East through Indonesia and over the Timor Sea into Australia, to name just a few examples. Any one of these routes could fill a book. Every place is different, but the story is always the same. Everywhere there is the same border. Everywhere people died across it, confronting the same barriers and guards. Everywhere there is the same human trafficking industry built up around it, with the same patterns of kidnapping, extortion, indentured servitude, slavery, and rape. Everything is blamed on these traffickers, who are not the cause of the problem, but a byproduct of it. Everywhere there is unequal exchange. High prices, low wages, and chaos on one side. High wages, low prices, and order on the other. Everywhere there is the same hyper-exploitation of undocumented labor in the interior, the same terror of deportation, the same profiteering off of detention and border militarization, and the same scapegoating of migrants and refugees. Everywhere there is the same attempt to outsource the problem to buffer states, Mexico, Morocco, Libya, Turkey, Indonesia. The same third-party deportations, the same leveraging of displaced people to negotiate concessions between these states and the states that call the shots in the first world, between the periphery and the core. Everywhere there is surplus humanity, who refuse to disappear, even though capitalism has no use for them. Increasingly, there is only one option left, one place left to turn, one employer still hiring. Pure nihilism. ISIS, Boko Haram, the Zetas, warlords. Even when every single door is closed, the excluded can still hire according to this principle. If our lives are worth nothing, then nothing is sacred. This is not the world in which I want to live. The core tenet of free trade, the globalized capitalism that has dominated the world since the end of the Cold War, is that capital should be able to move freely across borders, while labor and surplus humanity are constrained by them. The state's primary role, increasingly its only role, is to police the interior and guard the border. Citizenship has become the primary determinant in a multi-layered global caste system. After more than 25 years, the system appears to be operating less and less smoothly. It may be breaking down altogether. I'm opposed to all borders, and in favor of the free movement of all people across the face of the earth. I don't think that the practice of regulating movement according to place of birth is justifiable under any coherent ethical, philosophical, spiritual, or even legal system. Mind you, I'm not a utopian. I don't think there's any chance that borders will magically cease to exist, or that there would be no undesirable side effects if they did. However, any step in that direction is better than nothing. There are a few places where irregular migration is managed in a comparatively humane fashion, such as from Nicaragua into Costa Rica, from Syria into Lebanon, or from Bolivia, Paraguay, in Peru into Argentina and Brazil. Relaxing or abolishing the borders would produce new problems. But unless we believe that certain lives are more valuable than others, then from the standpoint of what will do the most good for the most people, we would be better off facing these problems directly, courageously, and as soon as possible. Yes, it would make it easier for terrorists to attack the West. But if the West ceased to be a sealed fortress sucking in resources, there would be less incentive to attack it. Yes, wars might spread. But like it or not, these wars are already on their way, with a vengeance, and the borders are only exacerbating the conditions that drive people to fight in them. The writing is on the wall. We live at the end of a time when the needs of certain people could be fulfilled at the expense of others, without a price. That era is drawing to a close. Chaos and order. The wall in the desert should be regarded as the symbol of my generation, as surely as the wall in Berlin was the symbol of the last one. Like the Berlin Wall, it will be torn down with hammers and bulldozers. I'll be there, if I'm still breathing. After the end of the Cold War, we were told that we had reached the end of history. The new era was to last forever. Liberal democracy, capitalist free trade, U.S. military hegemony, and a carefully managed system of borders to regulate the movement of labor in surplus populations. For a period of time in the 1990s, it was possible for some people to convince themselves that this was true. Nobody believes this story anymore, least of all the primary beneficiaries of the prevailing order. Their apocalyptic anxiety is written all over their movies, music videos, and advertisements, and especially their contingency plans. I won't even bother to touch on ecology. Everybody knows the party can't last, that the carriage turns into a pumpkin at midnight, and our children will reap the whirlwind. At the turn of the century, those of us who opposed the prevailing order understood ourselves as engaged in a bilateral confrontation, pitting the interlaced structures of state power and capitalism against the interests of humanity as a whole. I can no longer type those words with a straight face. Another world is always possible, as our slogan proclaimed, but now it's clear that we were not the only ones thinking about what the other world should look like, and that social instability in and of itself is not necessarily a good thing. So even if the neoliberal era is coming to an end, there are no guarantees that something better will take its place. Those who oppose this order in the name of liberation for all are not the only ones interested in tearing down its borders, nor the best armed, trained, or financed. ISIS may be the first fascist formation in history to be explicitly anti-racist and anti-nationalist. They actually managed to tear down a national border, which is more than any other movement or uprising has accomplished lately. ISIS miscalculated, of course. People do not tolerate chaos for very long. They look for any possible resolution, including totalitarianism if there is no other option and it isn't possible to escape. People who foment chaos for a living usually want to be the ones in charge. They usually fail. On the other hand, when truly pressed, the people in charge are usually willing to throw society into chaos in order to position themselves as the only way out of it. They often succeed. The old guard have a lot of fight in them still. This can be seen in both Syria and Mexico. ISIS saved Assad. The Zetas saved the PRI. As of this writing, ISIS is not winning. The Assad regime is. Likewise, the Zetas have lost momentum. Sinaloa and the PRI are more securely in power today than they were 10 years ago. Under pressure to transform society, in Mexico by La Otra Campaña in 2006, in Syria by the Arab Spring in 2011, the Syrian and Mexican elites brought on war rather than face revolution. In both cases, the mayhem that followed ultimately served to legitimize their rule. In both cases, it's only a matter of time before social movements reassert themselves to destabilize the existing order from below. Revolution turns into war. War justifies tyranny. Tyranny leads to revolution. Rock beats scissors, scissors cut paper, paper covers rock. The stakes of this game are increasingly global. Is there any way to win?
One of the founders of No More Deaths once told me a story called The Parable of the River. It may be familiar to readers who have worked in the nonprofit sector or in public health. The framing of the story is not perfect, and the metaphor is completely wrong in at least one major way. Migrants and refugees are never simply helpless victims, as I hope I have made clear in the preceding text. Most are not babies, and the children grow up fast. Nonetheless, the parable is well known for a good reason. It speaks to the central dilemma of desert aid work and other projects like it. It goes something like this. There's a small village on the edge of a river. One day, a villager goes down to the riverbank to wash some clothes. She sees a baby floating down the river. She jumps into the water and pulls the baby to safety. She carries him to the village and finds someone to care for him. Wet and tired, she returns to wash the clothes. She sees another baby floating down the river. Once again, she jumps into the swift current and takes the child into her arms. Before she can climb back onto the riverbank, she sees another baby floating towards her, and then another and another. She grabs one of them, but she only has 2 arms. The last 2 babies float past her. One disappears into the water just out of her reach. The other dashes his head open against a large rock. The woman looks up the river. 6 more babies are floating towards her. Horrified, she shouts for help. Villagers working in the field nearby run to help her. The babies keep coming. Soon, the entire village is occupied with the many tasks that the river demands. There are teams of strong swimmers who maintain a watch on the riverbank at all times. They pull babies out of the river until their muscles cramp and their teeth are chattering. Sometimes even the strongest swimmers go into the river once too often. They are swept under by the fierce cold current and their bodies are broken on the rocks. There are people who nurse the babies back to health and tend to their wounds. There are foster parents, carpenters, weavers, gardeners, hunters, teachers, therapists, and cooks. It takes a lot of work to ensure that all these babies are properly fed, clothed, housed, and integrated into the life of the village. There are people who do all of these things and still feel like they're not doing enough. It is not possible to pull every baby out of the river. Many drown, but the villagers feel that they are doing well to cope with the crisis as best as they can. Indeed, the village priest blesses them for their good work. Life goes on. Eventually, however, it becomes increasingly difficult to provide enough food to feed everyone and to find homes for so many babies. The villagers are exhausted and hungry and sad. Their nerves are shot. Tempers flare. Fights break out. Winter is coming. One day, 2 women are seen walking away from the village. "Where are you going?" another villager asked them, disconcerted. "We need you here. Can't you see how busy we are?" "You all carry on here," said one of the 2, machete in hand. The other woman is holding a pitchfork. "We're going upstream to stop whoever is throwing all these babies into the river." A noisy argument breaks out in the village square. "It's about time," roars the blacksmith, raising his hammer. "Why in the hell didn't we think of that before? We can't afford to go on like this forever. Count me in." Many of the villagers shout their approval. "Not so fast," counters the gravedigger, slamming his pick into the ground. "What will happen if we all just leave our posts? Who will watch the river? Who will care for the children already living among us? Who will staff the clinic or tend the fields? I'll tell you what will happen. More babies will drown." Many of the same villagers nod in solemn agreement. "This is a false dichotomy," protests the teenager who washes the dishes. "Some of us should go up the river and some of us should stay here." Most everyone agrees that she has a point, but this is a small village that we are talking about. "There are not enough of us," says the village priest. "And besides, let's say we decide to head upstream. You grab a shovel and I'll grab an axe. What will we find? Certainly it's possible that there has been some accident. Perhaps there is a gaping hole in a bridge somewhere beside a nursery. But that doesn't seem very likely. Given the sheer number of babies in the river, it seems that the most likely explanation is that some hateful or ruthless person is throwing them in. To what end? There must be some reason. What will we do if we find the villain? Will we attempt to reason with him and explain why, all things considered, throwing babies in the river is a bad thing to do? Will we push him into the river? Are we willing to kill him if that is the only way to end this vile practice? What if he is bigger than our friend the blacksmith? What if he has a gun and is not alone? What if his henchmen are armed with clubs, knives, pistols, shotguns, rifles, heavy artillery, tanks, helicopters, fighter jets, ballistic missiles, and nuclear bombs? How could we ever be able to stop him? Thankfully, the priest is missing something, and so is this parable. There are millions of people in the river. We have to become capable of helping each other out.
Transformation. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted, with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. Frederick Douglass, August 3rd, 1857. Revolution. Are we talking about a revolution then? What is revolution? What does it mean? Marx said it meant seizing the means of production. Lenin said it meant seizing state power. Nikhaev said it was the end to justify all means. Stalin said it could happen forever inside the borders of one nation-state. Mao stressed the importance of culture. Pol Pot said it would get us all off to a fresh start. Their dreams were a nightmare, and victory was worse than defeat. Can this concept be salvaged? I think so. What is it? Bakunin incarnated it. He also predicted how it would turn out if it were misunderstood as a way to put the right people in charge. Red Cloud and Crazy Horse never said a word about it. They didn't have to. Frederick Douglass made a run for it. William Lloyd Garrison argued for it. Harriet Tubman lived for it, and John Brown died for it, though they all called it God. Seth Conklin spent his whole life working for it, and almost nobody ever thanked him or remembered his name. It held out for a week on the barricades of the Paris Commune. Louis Ling told his captors to hang him for it, and then he beat them to it. Emma Goldman said you can dance to it. Alexander Berkman gave it his best shot, and they kept it together for 47 years. The Wobblies used to ride for it. Mother Jones used to dig it. DeRudy said we carry it in our hearts and that it's growing this minute. In the final month of his life, Malcolm X said that it will ultimately be a global clash between the oppressed and those who do the oppressing, between those who want freedom, justice, and equality for everyone, and those who want to continue the systems of exploitation. The Panthers had it all, but their enemies tore it apart. Out west, the heart; back east, the teeth; up north, the roots; down south, the guts. It scared the hell out of the government all the same. Fred Hampton said it best, and they killed him for it. The Weather Underground tried to set it off. Assata Shakur believed that it could still got us home to port, and she got away with it. The American Indian movement didn't say much about it. They didn't have to. The Zapatistas stopped talking about it and listened, and then it happened. It is happening again in Rojava, in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. I caught a glimpse of it in Seattle in 1999 and in Oakland in 2011, but then it slipped away. I'll mostly leave my generation out of it, though. It's not over yet. A hard lesson. I'm not an uncritical cheerleader for the Zapatistas. However, there's a reason they were able to bring about the first revolution of the postmodern era. They studied their predecessors carefully, applied the lessons that were useful to them, adapted their strategies to their environment, waited patiently until the time was right, acted boldly, and turned the world on its head. As the end of the postmodern era draws near, we should be studying our forebears just as carefully, starting with the Zapatistas themselves. The Zapatistas broke with all Marxist-Leninist tradition by demonstrating that the seizure of state power was a red herring. They declared war on the Mexican government with no intention of putting themselves in its place. Instead, they focused on establishing autonomous zones. Leftists were profoundly confused, I remember. Autonomy is the key word of the Zapatista rebellion. We can define autonomy as the freedom to make decisions and take action in all matters that affect us directly, without seeking permission from a higher power, starting at the level of the individual and scaling up. It took a year of armed struggle for this concept to fully emerge. Its first appearance in Zapatista canon is in the January 1995 Third Declaration of the Lacandon Jungle. By the Sixth Declaration in June 2005, it was central. At its core, the Zapatista movement is fighting for indigenous autonomy. By definition, it is both Mexican and Mayan, but it aims to inspire others to establish autonomous zones elsewhere as well. Zapatistas assert indigenous peoples' right to self-determination, which has been denied for over 500 years. They argue that the people indigenous to a particular territory should be free to administer their own economy, politics, and resources according to their own traditions and customs. This differs from separatism, and that the Zapatistas have been clear that they do not want their own state. Furthermore, on January 1, 1994, the first day of the rebellion, the EZLN defined a right of the people living in Zapatista territory to resist any unjust actions of the EZLN itself, saying that people should acquire and possess arms to defend their persons, families, and property against armed attacks committed by the revolutionary forces or those of the government. This is the acid test. Revolutionaries who claim a monopoly on force the way that the state does are not to be trusted. When you see that, run away as fast as you can. On the scale of society, autonomy might be understood as the ability to hold a territory plus a decentralized and participatory decision-making process to administer it, minus a monopoly on force. Revolution can be pictured as the bridge from here to there. 22 years of indigenous autonomy in postmodern Chiapas is a truly stunning achievement. The best of the European revolutionary tradition can scarcely point to anything like this in living memory. It's not perfect, but I'll take a flawed reality that I can hold in my hands over a perfect ideal that I can never touch, every time. So far, so good, but there's no denying that things haven't gone very well in Mexico for the past decade. The Zapatista enclaves remain, but elsewhere everything has gone from bad to worse. The Mexican state has drawn a line in the sand. They've lost control of part of Chiapas, but they'd rather set their own house on fire than risk losing control of the rest of it. The September 2014 kidnapping and murder of 43 students from the Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College in Guerrero sent a clear message that La Otra Campaña is finished, that indigenous autonomy will not be allowed to spread to other parts of Mexico, and that there's nothing that the Zapatistas can do about it anymore. What happened? I'll defer to Mexicans more directly involved in this, but as an American participating in the movement, here's my take. It comes down to guns. At the moment, autonomous zones exist only where tolerated, as in Chiapas, or fiercely defended, as in Rojava. Spaces of autonomy that are not tolerated and cannot defend themselves will be wiped off the face of the earth. It gives me no joy to say this, Armed self-defense can turn into war very quickly. War is costly, in blood and treasure. Weapons and ammunition don't come cheaply and have to come from some source. So armed struggle almost always demands state support. This is obviously a conundrum. Why would any state want to preserve spaces of autonomy? Generally, they don't. Fine, but this generally means that when revolution turns into war, autonomy is the first casualty. Central to the Zapatistas' breakthrough was their understanding that war is not won on the battlefield alone. The driving force of the revolution is not to be found in armed conflict, but in a better way of life. Unfortunately, the state always seems to have an ace in the hole. Against all odds, the Zapatistas remain unvanquished. Their ongoing revolution has been an inspiration to millions of people worldwide for an entire generation, myself included. But the path to another world that they tried to open to us all has been submerged in an ocean of blood. There is no easy solution to this dilemma. These same dynamics turned Syria into a living hell, as various participants in the civil war escalated the level of violence until they had stripped themselves of their humanity and converted each other into symmetrical killing machines. The revolutionaries in Rojava are walking a razor's edge, forced to balance the danger of being co-opted by the American government tomorrow against that of being annihilated by ISIS today. The Zapatistas have been juggling these machetes for over 20 years. All I can say is that it's generally undesirable for revolution to turn into war, that nonetheless sometimes it will, and that when it does, both will be won or lost together. It won't be possible to win the war by abandoning the revolution, or to advance the revolution while ignoring the war. I've seen the same patterns recur in history, current events, and my own experiences.
In 2010 and 2011, I spent some time working with Triqui people from the municipality of San Juan Copala in Oaxaca. Triquis there had taken part in the 2006 uprising in Oaxaca, and in January 2007, the municipality declared autonomy along the lines of the Zapatista model. By November 2009, paramilitaries aligned with the state government had placed the entire community under siege, cutting off access to water, food, medical services, and electricity. Gunmen stationed in the hills surrounding the town were shooting at anything that moved. Numerous people were killed. On April 27, 2010, a small group of outside supporters, also veterans of the 2006 uprising, attempted to break the siege with a caravan of several vehicles full of food, water, and medical supplies. Paramilitaries ambushed the caravan outside of Copala, shouting and killing 2 participants, Alberta Betty Cariño Trujillo, a widely respected Mixteca and the director of an indigenous organization named Cactus, and Judy Jacola, a Finnish solidarity worker who was well integrated into the Oaxacan social struggle. The survivors escaped into the mountains, several wounded, emerging alive days later and many miles away after having sent out gripping videos of the ordeal over their cell phones. The story briefly made American news. The outcry in Mexico was tremendous. I think it's fair to say that the story was especially compelling to many people because of who died. In Betty's case, Triquis and Mixtecas have a very long and contentious history. In the American context, it might be like if a Hopi woman was killed while attempting to stop the relocation of Navajo or Dene elders on Black Mesa, or if an Ojibwe woman was killed while bringing supplies to Lakota water protectors at Standing Rock. And Judy was Finnish. It was not lost on anyone that he had come from halfway across the world to risk his life for indigenous autonomy. Many people thought it was strange that he was involved. One of the survivors of the first caravan told me once. It wasn't. Judy knew exactly what he was getting into. He was one of us, and his death was a terrible loss. Copala is the only campaign that I've ever been involved with in which I would regularly see indigenous people carrying around pictures of a martyred white solidarity worker, rather than the other way around. Betty and Judy's names will be tied together as long as either of them are remembered. In June 2010, a much larger caravan was organized to break the siege, this time comprised of numerous buses and dump trucks full of hundreds of people and supplies from all over Mexico. I was there too. Even by my standards, this was a hair-raising experience. The caravan was repeatedly held up by police as it approached Copala and shadowed by groups of masked gunmen posted on hills above the road. It's impossible to say if they were police, military, paramilitary, or some combination of the three. Shortly after nightfall, several miles outside of town, the uniformed police announced that they wouldn't guarantee our security, and they all left. This was a do-or-die moment. It was very hard to say what would happen next. As participants in the caravan, we had agreed to defer ultimate decision-making power to a core group of triquis from San Juan Copala. This leadership had agreed to take input from all participants into consideration. Leadership was faced with a difficult choice. They decided to turn back. This caused a complete uproar. People were screaming at each other in the middle of the road and trying to decide what to do. The reader may remember the Gaza Freedom Flotilla of May 31st, 2010, when 9 humanitarian aid workers were killed by the Israeli military while attempting to break the blockade of the Gaza Strip. That occurred just a matter of days before our caravan. The Triqui leadership, to paraphrase, said, "Palestine is known throughout the world. They just killed those people in cold blood and nothing happened. We're a small indigenous group. Nobody knows about us anywhere. The paramilitaries have already shown that they'll kill people and the government won't do anything about it. We know them well. This is too dangerous. If we don't turn back, some of you are going to die. We already have the deaths of 2 outsiders on our consciousness. We don't want any more." Many participants said in turn, "This is your only chance. You'll never have this much momentum again. What did you call us here for if you didn't think you could call their bluff? If you turn back now, the government will take it as a sign of weakness, and they will destroy you within a few months. It will be a setback for indigenous autonomy everywhere. This is bigger than you. It's bigger than any of us. If they kill us, there's at least some chance that Mexico will explode." Leadership deliberated one more time and turned us back. Within a few months, the paramilitaries burned out the last inhabitants of the autonomous municipality, culminating in a final offensive of killings and rapes in September 2010. As of 2016, displaced people from Copala are still camped out in the Zocalo in the city of Oaxaca. They have never been able to return home. In the years since, I've spoken with several of the people who had to make this decision. I also learned that one of them had subsequently migrated through the Arivaca corridor in 2011, picking up water that we had set out along the way. I can see that the retreat still weighs heavy on them. It may have been where La Otra Campaña died. It may have saved my life. Nobody can say. I don't know myself. I'm afraid both statements may be correct. I consented to defer to those people and I respect the decision they made. In the aftermath of the second caravan, I would hear conversations like this. They've left you 2 choices, surrender or war. The response would be, the paramilitaries are financed by the state government. We are poor people, financed by nobody. It's all well and good to talk about armed struggle. If we went to war, how would we afford guns and ammunition? And where would we get them? Are you going to supply them? We would lose. The siege of San Juan Copala taught me a hard lesson. Unarmed resistance is suicide in the face of a ruthless enough foe. But armed struggle without state support may be suicide as well. Writing in 1943, George Orwell suggested that this was why fascism triumphed in the Spanish Civil War as well. In looking back on the Spanish War, he argues that the outcome of the war was settled in London, Washington, and Paris when the West declined to arm the revolutionary militias. In military terms, I'm afraid Orwell was right. When unarmed resistance turns into armed conflict, military considerations cannot be ignored or wished away. So is it better to seek state support in hopes of winning, or to not do so and almost certainly lose? Every situation is different. I honestly don't know. Fortunately, there's another way to tell this story. In revolutionary terms, we can agree with Orwell that the outcome of the struggle in Spain was indeed determined in Paris and Washington and London, and Moscow, and Marrakesh, and Algiers, but not by the authorities. It was determined by the common people when they chose not to rise up and extend the revolution from Spain to the rest of the world. We might never be able to count on heads of state, but we can hope that the people they count on will sometimes refuse to carry out their orders. As long as revolt is spreading and the authorities do not know who will be the next to break ranks, the ordinary rules of war do not apply. In this situation, a drastically under-equipped populace can outmaneuver a world-class military. This is precisely what occurred in France in 1848, in Russia in 1917, and in Egypt in 2011. In each case, it was only afterwards, when a new configuration of authorities was established, supposedly to complete and fulfill the revolution, that the movement was crushed. On March 18, 1871, French soldiers refused to obey an order to fire on women and workers. That single refusal gave birth to the Paris Commune, one of the most famous revolutionary autonomous zones in history, and it was nearly enough to topple the entire government of France. For a few years, the whole country trembled on the brink of revolution as everyone waited to see whether other soldiers would desert, other cities rise up. But the Commune was defeated from the moment that it started firing back on the army that was sent to force it out of Paris. Until that point, the government was terrified that the rest of the military would revolt too. But once ordinary soldiers regarded the Commune as a military enemy, it was just a war again, and the woefully outnumbered and under-equipped communards were bound to lose. This illustrates the difference between war and revolution. I think the Zapatistas understood this. They recognized that they needed enough firepower to repel the Mexican government, but that the threat that their revolt might become contagious was the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. To put this all together, the short-term survival of autonomous territories often depends on physical superiority over a completely ruthless foe, which unfortunately demands an arms supply and arms suppliers. I've seen this with my own eyes. Midterm survival likely depends on revolutionary momentum spreading far enough to keep the place from being encircled, embargoed, and economically choked into submission. And long-term survival ultimately implies some kind of global revolutionary transformation. The faster this all takes place, the less bloody it's likely to be. For what it's worth, the defeat at Copala does seem to have informed later struggles, such as the ones in Santa Maria, Ostula, and Cherán, both in Michoacán. The Nahua community of Ostula set a precedent in the region when it rose up in arms to protect its land from resource extraction carried out by local cartels affiliated with the state government, namely iron mining and the illegal logging of the endangered Sangualica tree. The Perepecha community of Cherán also rose up in arms in 2011 to defend its communal forests from logging operations affiliated with the state government and local cartels. Both communities have organized rondas comunitarias, community militias, to defend themselves from attack. I don't know where the money or weapons come from in Ostula or Cherán, but I'm willing to bet that part of the explanation for the success of the rondas and the expansion of indigenous autonomy in Michoacán is that this question has been answered there somehow. Cherán and Ostula committed themselves to collective armed self-defense, while Copala did not. Copala was annihilated. People who fed me, told me stories, advocated for my well-being, and stood by my side during the second caravan were left widowed, orphaned, homeless, in prison, living in exile, and dead. Thus far, Cherán and Ostula remain standing. This is probably not a coincidence.
The price of freedom is death. Malcolm X.
You've just listened to episode 10 of No Wall They Can Build, a guide to borders and migration across North America, published by the CrimethInc Ex-Workers Collective. Stay tuned next week for our 11th and final episode, From East to West, Part 2, Solidarity and Home. This audiobook is a production of the Ex-Worker Podcast Collective. You can check us out at crimethinc.com/podcast. To order a print copy of the book, read a free PDF version online, check out the poster that accompanies the book, or to learn more about the anarchist struggle for a world without borders, visit crimethinc.com/borders. To learn more about No More Deaths and solidarity work in the desert along the U.S.-Mexico border, visit nomoredeaths.org.